Good day to all. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this web panel on the new ICAO methodology for assessing and reporting runway surface conditions, also known as GRF, which stands for Global Reporting Format. Today we are spanning the world's time zones, with Dunia hosting from Montreal. I'm in Bangkok, and the panelists will present from France, Germany, and the UK. This is the first time for the ICAO webinar series in which we have multiple presenters and representing other organizations. That's why I've called it a web panel as opposed to a webinar. I have to admit that we didn't expect such a large audience. I think we have 1,500 registered and already 1,000 joining us now. So especially for a webinar on such a specific topic, which is not even related to COVID-19. Only 1 year ago, during the Global Symposium on GRF, relatively few in the aviation industry were very familiar with the GRF subject. But I'm very pleased now with the poll that we just did to see that this is no longer the case. We can see that there's a good proportion of our colleagues who are familiar with GRF, and based on some of the more detailed poll questions, we can see that the understanding is there as well in terms of what is required to implement this new requirement. To introduce the GRF topic, most of us know that runway surface conditions have contributed to many aircraft accidents and incidents, and the safety investigations have revealed shortfalls in the accuracy and timeliness of assessment and reporting methods. The new GRF system is designed to report on the runway surface conditions in a standardized manner, such that flight crew are able to more accurately predict the airplane takeoff and landing performance. The objective is to contribute to the global reduction in runway excursion, incidents, and accidents. Although the GRF subject is not related to COVID, the current pause in our industry during this tragic pandemic allows us to prepare better for the timely and effective implementation of this new safety measure. The deadline for global implementation of the new standards is the 5th of November, 2020. That is only less than 6 months away from today. And note that the implementation duration in states was expected to require at least 2 years by the experts. The new requirements were included in several ICAO annexes and PANs published in 2016. And since then, ICAO has developed various implementation support tools, including published guidance material, launched online and classroom training courses, organized a global symposium last year in March, regional seminars, sub-regional workshops and webinars. We've established a GRF website and conducted runway safety Go team assistance missions to provide assistance to states with GRF implementation as well. All of these actions to support states with the implementation in progress. This implementation support has been achieved in collaboration with the experts who developed the new standards and the partner organizations representing the stakeholders in industry, which include ACI, IATA, CANSO, and the aircraft manufacturers, and various others. This reflects the same coordination and collaboration required for implementation in states between the civil aviation authorities, airport operators, air navigation service providers, and aircraft operators. The panel today brings together 3 of the experts which contributed to the development of the standards and guidance material. They will share with us an update and refresher on the GRF implementation requirements, as well as providing an opportunity to discuss and support the implementation experiences and lessons learned. I'm very pleased to introduce the 3 experts on the panel, who are all members of the ICAO Friction Task Force. Gentlemen, please turn on your videos. Very good, so now we're complete. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to introduce you to Arman Norheim. He's of the Civil Aviation Authority of Norway and the rapporteur of the ICAO Friction Task Force. Next, we have Vasileios Stefanorios, who is a senior aerodromes expert of the European Union Aviation Safety Agency and also a member of the ICAO Friction Task Force. And next, we have Lars Grunstedt, who is a performance expert of the Airbus Flight Operations Support and Services and the rapporteur of the Annex 6 and 8 subgroup of the ICAO Friction Task Force. For your further reference, their biographies are posted on the webpage for this webinar. The conduct for today will be that each panelist will deliver a 15 to 20 minutes presentation, and following the completion of all three presentations, we will have a panel discussion driven by the most popular questions from the audience. Questions should be added to the Q&A function, as was explained by Dunia, and voted upon by the participants. Please don't put your questions in the chat box, and please don't raise your hands because we're not able to monitor this at the same time. So all the questions should go into the Q&A box, and then as you see the questions, please vote on them, and especially if you have the same questions so that it can get a priority when we enter the panel discussion. For the first presentation, I now want to hand you over to Lars Konsted of Airbus. Lars, you may unmute your microphone, share your screen, and then the rest of us will all turn off our videos and mute our microphones. Please go ahead, Lars.
Hello. It's a pleasure to reach out to so many people all around the world at this time where we all have such restrictions on travel, which are also hurting the industry quite so hard. So in my presentation, I will give you a short introduction to why we have done the new GRF, what it is about, because I have seen in the poll that there are still quite a few of you that are not familiar with the whole system. And then I will focus on some points regarding the operators, so the airlines who will put this into place. As we always have to do in such a context, we have to look at the reason why we're bringing in a new safety initiative. And in this case, we're talking about preventing runway excursions. Now, runway excursions are certainly not the largest proportion of accidents that create fatalities, but they are consistently about 1/3 of the accidents that cause hull losses. So they generate a lot of financial damage, but whenever you have a runway excursion, it is also down to pretty much luck whether or not you will have fatalities and injuries. So it is obviously a big industry drive to reduce this type of accident. And we have not been, over the last 10 years, extremely successful in doing so. The runway excursions are the one type of accident that tend to resist our efforts so far, even if we do see in recent times a decline. It is at this point too early to say whether this is already due to the initiatives that have been launched by industry in order to address the causal factors. And when you look at those causal factors, they tend to include always some type of degraded runway condition. And this is what the global reporting format is trying to address. It's trying to improve the way that we look at the runway in order to report it to pilots, and for the pilots to be able to assess the effect on performance more accurately. So talking about the effect of the runway condition on aircraft performance, we have different factors on the runway that affect the way that the aircraft will, mostly in our context here, be able to brake. So we have inbuilt criteria like the macro texture, the microtexture. We can have some sort of contamination that falls onto this runway due to the weather, like winter contamination, ice and snow, but also water, which is a huge concern when we're looking at runway excursions. We also have to consider the degradation of the runway over time, be it due to the alteration of its surface or due to the accumulation of rubber or other polishing effects. So none of this is exactly new, and in performance, we have tried to model these effects by looking at two major contributors to the braking action that an aircraft can achieve on a given surface, which is the friction, and that includes aquaplaning effects where the tire is separated from the runway surface. And the contaminants, the drag effects that the contaminants, and that includes a layer of water, may cause on the aircraft, which is mostly critical when we want to accelerate on the surface. So this also has an impact on takeoff. So in order to achieve performance relevant reporting, which was the task of the ICAO Friction Task Force, we have to provide information to the flight crew that is important to their assessment and to their understanding of the runway state. And the operational need is to know what is on the runway. Is it covering a portion that will have a significant effect on the performance capabilities of the aircraft? How deep is it when it's a fluid contaminant? So this will have an effect on the aquaplaning and on the drag effects. And something that the industry has perhaps not been looking at enough in terms of reporting is, are the built-in qualities of the surface still okay, or are they starting to become deficient in such a way that it will affect the capability of the aircraft versus the expectations that we put into our models? So to fulfill this operational need, a new assessment and reporting method, the GRF, was put together, and it includes only the essential information for the awareness of the situation and for the capability of assessing the performance of the aircraft. This information is updated according to the relevant criteria, which will induce changes on this performance. The aerodromes know what to look for in order to know what significant changes that needs to be reported into the system. And as you understand from this, this is an end-to-end system which involves all of the stakeholders of aviation. Obviously, the aerodromes who need to look at their runway and report the conditions. The manufacturers who need to provide performance. The information is relayed by the ATM, and the operators who need to use it appropriately. And this end-to-end system has been achieved by defining a common language regarding the contaminant types that can be reported and used throughout the system. By defining a new concept, which is the runway condition code, and which we will see a little bit later in this presentation, but which is a direct input into the performance assessment that can be made by the flight crew. And as I said, performance relevance was throughout this effort always the main consideration for putting information in and for identifying what is significant in terms of criteria and in terms of changes. Now, it is an industry consensus that was put together by all of the stakeholders that have contributed and continue to contribute to the implementations that are being run by the various states and regions. And to support this effort, ICAO has produced a large number of documentation, which includes annexes and PANs and documents which are guidance. So we see that obviously the main document for aerodromes will be the Annex 14, supported by the PANs aerodromes, which will provide the procedures, already it does, and the Circular 355, which gives background information and guidance to aerodromes. On the aircraft manufacturer's side, we have a small change to the Annex 8, and we will soon see the aircraft performance manual, which will be published in its unedited form soon. Then we have on the AAS ATM side, Annex 11 and 15, which are supported by the PANs and the DOC 444 for the phraseology and the format of the new SNOTAM format. And on the operator side, Annex 6, which is also supported by the same aeroplane performance manual. The tasks that fall to the main changes that fall onto the different stakeholders are the way that aerodromes are going to assess and report surface conditions, the way that aircraft manufacturers are going to provide performance information, the way that the information is relayed by SNOTAMs and via ATIS to the flight crew. And it includes for the flight crew a new requirement to perform performance assessment at time of landing, and also to report into the system whenever worse than previously reported runway conditions are observed by the crew, so to provide a special air report. The keystone of this whole effort is the runway condition assessment matrix. And we're going to go into the various elements of this immediately. It is the method by which we can assess how much the aircraft is affected by whatever is on the runway. And what you see here is the complete version, which has been built predominantly for winter conditions. But this system is equally applicable around the world in all those countries that are affected by rain. And I don't think that anybody is exempt from that. So we also have a simplified version of this matrix, which addresses the changes of runway conditions due to the presence of water. And it allows a simplified assessment by the concerned aerodromes that do not see winter conditions in their region. It is no less important, though, to report these variations in wet conditions, because you can see already from this matrix that a little bit more water on the runway can lead to a stark degradation of the conditions for the aircraft. Let's have a look at the elements of this matrix. I was talking already about the runway condition code. The runway condition code is the single most important information for the flight crew when assessing landing performance. And it is the result of an overall assessment of the runway, looking at all the other criteria, like the contaminant type, the depth of the contaminant, the outside air temperature for some of the contaminants, other observations such as vehicle braking used by the ground crew, air reps provided by preceding flight crew, and coverage which is not directly in the runway condition assessment matrix, but which is part of the assessment process. You may have noticed that this matrix no longer includes measured friction as a criterion for reporting to aircraft, because all of these things that you see on the screen are relevant to aircraft performance. Measured friction is not directly relevant to it. It does not represent a metric that will be useful in assessing how the aircraft will perceive the runway condition. So the predominant thing to know about the RCAM is that all the reporting criteria and all the significant changes that come in the procedures associated with this RCAM have been set for relevance to aircraft performance. The assessment process itself consists in putting together the information that is contained in the RCR, or the Runway Condition Report. Again, only information that is directly relevant has been included, and you see a list of it here. You also see how this information should be sourced, and you will find again and again in this table the visual observation. It is the central tool to the assessment of runway conditions for the GRF. So measurements may be useful, but are not required. This is a system that is accessible to anybody, whether they're equipped with sophisticated measurement equipment or not. To help the aerodrome operators, we have provided in the procedural material some flowcharts that also give you a process on how to assess your runway condition on a day-to-day basis. You can find this in the PANS aerodromes, and you can find additional methods and information in the Circular 355. The runway condition report itself has these elements, and you see on the left side in color that those that are part of the aircraft performance section. So all the elements in the aircraft performance section have to be reported for any report that is generated. So whenever there is an overall assessment that says there is at least in 1/3 an effect on the aircraft braking capability. And you see at the bottom 3 examples of such reports. On the right side, you have a list of items that can be reported in the situational awareness section, which are not directly relevant to aircraft performance, but that are judged important for the flight crew in order to assess the risks of an operation. One important constituent of the overall GRF system is a new set of landing distances provided by manufacturers. And these landing distances are more accurate than what we have been doing before. To start with, landing distances never used to include the outside temperature and the slope of the runway as a criterion for their determination, which is frankly surprising considering the magnitude of the impact they can have. It is also calculated for an operational approach speed and takes into account an operational flare distance. It takes into account the use of automation like autoland and auto-brake. We are allowed to use the benefit of reverse thrust, and this is important to understand for flight crew. It is available primarily for the runway condition codes 1 through 6 that we have seen in the RCAM. It should probably not include any benefit of drag, because this is always beneficial on whenever you are braking in aircraft. And it should include a margin of at least 15%, except in cases of emergency. So for us manufacturers, we now provide a new set of tables that are only shown for these various runway condition codes and their associated braking action terms, good, medium, poor, and intermediates. And so we have one table for each of these conditions, but obviously it is also the same criteria whenever using an electronic flight bag. Obviously, the GRF was designed to provide benefits for aircraft operators. It is a harmonized global standard, which will mean that pilots will hear the same type of information wherever they operate in the world, and it will mean the same. It is easier to understand than the current snow term, which comes with a lot of codes, and probably most pilots need some sort of help in order to decode it. While the new snow term can be directly read, and everything is available in directly as the final text, like the contaminant types. There is a direct relation to operational procedures and performance, as I have pointed out several times now. And we've also improved the relevance and the timeliness of the reporting. It overall creates a better situational awareness for pilots, and a big attention was put onto having the same information, synchronous information, through all the different channels, be it the SNOTAM, the ATIS, or the ATC. Pilots are able to influence the overall system by providing air-ups whenever it is necessary, and to provide continuous observation whenever changes may occur. But every new system comes also with challenges. And the new level of performance relevance that we have achieved has also increased the expectations for improving the decision-making process, whatever the runway conditions. And so the fact that we're giving information by third of runway can create a new challenge for pilots to assess the performance accurately. Also, it is currently felt that the ATIS reports may become quite lengthy on multi-runway airports, so there's still an ongoing effort in order to reduce the amount of information that is transmitted by ATIS. Evenly, we also have to get this runway condition report into the cockpit while the aircraft is in flight in order to get the latest information to the flight crew. This is the purpose of the whole GRF, and it is important that the technical means are put into place for the pilots to fully benefit of the new system. The system was primarily designed to address the issues on landing because that's where we had the largest proportion of accidents, but it is obviously also useful for takeoff. And for takeoff, we have been perhaps a little bit slow in making the adaptations for the pilot to fully take the benefit of the new information provided in order to make the best possible assessment for takeoff. Even though it has to be said that during takeoff, the exposure to runway excursions is much reduced. We also have a new runway condition to deal with, which is slippery wet. And pilots may encounter the fact where the runway condition code is not matching the expectation from the runway condition assessment matrix for the reported contaminants. And in this case, a conservative way of assessing performance has to be found. Many pilots around the world are also not trained today in making special air reports. And that takes us to the next section, which is these procedures need to be trained, and procedures need to be put into place by the airlines to make best use of the system. And when we're talking about the approach preparation, it is important to give the pilot the means to have canned decisions, as they're called. That means that all the calculations, all of the assessments are made way before the final approach in order to assess what the maximum crosswind, for example, or the minimum runway condition code that are acceptable for a given operation are, so that quick decisions can be taken by the flight crew. So pilots need to be trained to understand the assumptions in their computation, to know what they're covered for and what not. They need to understand the RCAM, the RCR, the various formats. They need to have a grasp of the reporting process. They need to understand that up and downgrading exists. They have to be aware of how a runway can change under given conditions, and a particular attention should there be paid to the wet condition and the conditions of high water precipitation, so heavy rain. Training is obviously now a challenge during the pandemic because we would have liked training to include also classroom and simulator sessions in order to really get the attention of the flight crew. These are now very difficult to organize. So ICAO is currently considering a delay of the applicability date. It was given as the 5th of November of this year, but it may change. Some states have already announced delays. This is not an excuse for losing momentum. Even though it is difficult currently to reach all the stakeholders, it's important to keep up the effort, to use the efforts that have already been put into place. We have seen that half of the states consider that they will be ready by the end of this year, and they should use this in order to use the next winter as a test opportunity. Also, just to mention, there is an ICAO encouraged training that has been put together by IATA. It's a CBT, so it's a 3-hour training, and which can produce a certificate which is available for all the actors within the airlines. So as I said, this is an initiative that was put into place for the operators to allow safer operations. It is a new format, very easy to learn, which is a direct input into the performance assessment at time of landing and working through the outcome. And it is very important to remember that this is global. So that concludes my presentation, and it's my pleasure to hand on now to Arman.
So if I just may, thank you very much, Lars, for that excellent presentation. And if you could please stop sharing your screen and turn off your video and mute your microphone. And I'm sure you generated a lot of questions, especially from the pilot community, of which we have many participants. So please remember, the question should go in the question and answer box. And if someone else has asked a question that is similar to yours, please click on the like. And that way it will get more votes and will be answered first in priority. So thank you very much, Lars. Now, Arman, I see that you've already turned on your video, so you may also unmute your microphone and start sharing your screen and commence your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Mitchell, and hello to everybody worldwide. So Lars told you about the system, and I will bring you a little bit further and try to narrow it down. So we're talking about the ICAO Global Reporting System and format, and we have a challenge. There's a willingness to change. Lars mentioned a lot of things, and change to what? To summarize what Lars mentioned, if you have on the top there, then we have all the documentation that was developed by ICAO. In the green brackets is the one that's developed by the Friction Task Force. I won't go into any detail on it. The next level of documentation comes from the state regulatory process. So then these standards and recommendations and guidance material from ICAO becomes state regulatory documentation. Below that, we have the operational need. That was Lars talked about. That was the need that the aircraft, the safe operation of the aircraft, are in need of the information. And we provide it with the runway condition report, which you see to the bottom left. And if we don't meet operational need, the pilot's going to make a remark, send an error back to the aerodrome, to the runway condition report. It's part of the system. But for this to be a closed loop, we need to send information to the end user. So with this, we get a kind of an overview of the operational need, the runway condition report, why we report it, and how it's been communicated. So if we focus on the runway condition report, and you will see that I write assessment. We've been faced quite a lot with questions about measurements. But what we ask for is an assessment, not really a measurement. And a measurement can be a part of assessment. And you see here the eye, which was shown by Lars also, and will be several places in my presentation, which represent the originator. And the eye is the most important tool. And the originator of the information is at the aerodrome. For most of the world, wet is the condition that they experienced. Not all parts of the world focus on the snow, slush, and ice. So in the rest of my presentation, I will leave out the snow, slush, and ice and focus on the wet and see what that means for the runway condition report. The principles are the same, but for the wet conditions, we don't have what last called the upgrade. So we don't need to worry about that part of the procedure. And it's all quite simple, really. What the aerodrome need to identify is the dry condition. That's simple enough. And then the wet condition. That's also simple enough. Then come the wet, slippery wet. Now we come into a little more complicated situation. And at the end, we have the standing water. These are really the 4 things that the aerodrome has to report, the conditions. Then comes this with the 3 millimeter trigger value. Above 3 millimeter, we have the standing water. And it's a trigger value because it's also trigger how to report. So with up to and including 3 millimeter, the wet runway condition report is using the ATM, ATS, and ATIS service only. Above that, we also make use of the NOTAM and SNOTAM system in addition to the ATIS. So another thing with this 3 millimeter is that it kind of addresses a maintenance issue. Because if you are into these situations, unless you are in an area of the world where the downpour, the heavily downpour is such that it's oversaturated the runway and you get standing water for that reason. Other than that, this situation relates to a maintenance issue. And if you have a maintenance issue, you should also publish a NOTAM. And through this, with the NOTAM for the maintenance, you also get information for this 3 millimeter. We also talk about the coverage. We're going to give a description of how many % of the runway which are covered, and for each runway third. But the main focus is on the path of the wheels along the runway. So again, 3 millimeter depth assessed. You assess it. Measurements, they are related to the maintenance issue. So during your maintenance, you will get the measurements, and then you know when you do the assessment. So again, using your eye, you know how your runway drains during a rainstorm. Do you have any rutting, streams of water along the ruts? Or do you have any ponding as it dries up? If you have, you're kind of into a maintenance issue. Again, the main focus is on the path of the wheels along the runway. So, maintenance issue, and here we come in with measurements. Rutting, if you have that. The simplest instrument is an ordinary straight edge and a ruler. And that straight edge could be a line between stretched, and you measure from that line. You need 3 persons and a ruler. Same with the ponding. Then the state of the microtexture. This is a slippery wet. Then that's an indication that the runway don't have the sharpness it should have. An old method was by the touch as such. There are lots of other tools that can be used. But for the runway condition report, you use an assessment For the maintenance issue, it's kind of a business model you have, what kinds of tools you want to use. And it's the management of the runway surface characteristics, which is really the issue here. It's a trend monitoring, and you publish with the NOTAM, rutting, ponding, and slippery wet. But this is really not the reporting issue. This is the maintenance issue, and it comes as what you need to do a proper runway condition reporting. And the trend monitoring concept, you will find that in another ICAO document. And that's really how you maintain your runway. You monitor the different characteristics, and you see how they degrade, and you intervene and point to bring it up at a certain level, and you make sure that it never goes below a minimum friction level, which has to be set by the state. And the reason for this that's set by the state is that the traditional tool used, there can be no global standard tied up to the runway friction measurement devices as such. So there's no global values to be used for these. And the method and methodology to be used has to be set by the state. And it's not only related to the friction measurement devices. That can be also investigation into aircraft data. It can be complaints, air reps coming from pilots. It's, in short, it's all kind of information that can be tied up to the payment management. So then, if we look into what is the runway condition report for a wet runway, this is the information string that goes into the XXX indicate the airdrome. Then we have the date and time group. Then we have the lowest runway destination number, and we have 555, which is the runway condition code. Then we have the percentage coverage. The depth for wet runway is not applicable. We don't report it. And then it's wet, wet, wet. If we look into the situation with more than 3 millimeter, you see what really changed is the runway condition code. The aircraft operator now needs to take into account a much degraded runway. And he also, at the same time, he should have had additional information in the NOTAM, giving more information into what this is. And this NOTAM is also the base information from that. When producing this NOTAM, you also get the information you need to do the assessment. So you see this is kind of related. So in the upper example, up to including 3 millimeter, your runway seems to be up to standard. You have a trend monitoring. At the lower one, you have a runway maintenance issue. The trend monitoring is always going on. To give some historical background, what you see here is by Airbus, they present how the different generation of aircraft and the volume of movement up to the current date has evolved. If we use this as a background, and at the far right there, you see the initiative from the TALPA ARC, which the Friction Task Force built upon, ICAO built upon, and the EASA rulemaking. You will see that behind there, you will see the 3rd and 4th generation of aircrafts. So these are the aircraft that will use the information. At this slide, you will see again a friction table, mu meter, 0.550 for 0.50 for maintenance. Mentioned the NOTAM, and you see the 3 millimeter depth and 100 millimeter length. This length is a length that has been given as guidance for a significant portion of a runway. And all this was established and in place in the period from 1959 until 1990-91. And if you look to the right, as part of the work of the friction task force and for ICAO, this friction table for snow and ice has been discontinued. The mu meters of 0.50 is a very weak relation to aircraft performance, which and it has been a background for the use from the friction mesh devices as such, and it's much debated, and it's part of why this is also on the state level. But more importantly, you see this 3 mm depth. It's nothing new. It's been there for 30 years. 100 meter length for a significant portion of runway for maintenance or reporting purposes. It's been in the guidance as a note, though, from ICAO also for 30 years. So there's really no change in this. But admittedly, having had this implementation of the global reporting format, it's come to our knowledge that the culture of applying this 3 mm depth, 100 meter length, and issuing NOTAMs hasn't been a culture all over. So it seems that in addition to the runway condition report of the global reporting format, there need to be a focus on this issuing NOTAM when your runway is not up to standard. And if you have a focus on that, then you get the information you need to do the runway condition report in a very simple way. And this brings my presentation to an end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arman, for that excellent presentation. I think you were speaking directly to our airport and ANSP colleagues there in trying to understand what the new requirements are and what's required for implementation. Earlier, for those participants who may think are hearing this for the first time and may think this is kind of complicated, it's actually not. Earlier we mentioned the IATA ICAO training. There's also another one which is an ACI ICAO online training. It only takes 3 hours. And once you complete those 3 hours, you really have a full grasp of what is required to be done, and you'll realize that actually the concept is not complicated. It's simple. It's just a matter of coordinated implementation. So Arman, if I may ask you to stop sharing your screen and turn off your video and mute your microphone. And I'd like to invite Vasileios, our third speaker for today. I see you already, so your video is on and your mic seems to be unmuted. So all you need to do is share your screen. Over to you. Thank you.
So I think everything is okay now. So hello to everybody, and thank you very much, Michelle, for giving me the opportunity to present this very, very interesting webinar. So I'm taking over from Lars and Arman, and I will try to give you some tips and some information how to proceed with the implementation of the GRF at the regional and at state level. So my presentation will have a short introduction about the method. I think that you have heard a lot from Arman. I will give you an outline of the implementation plan, the involved stakeholders, and the actions that, well, in our view, are necessary in order to implement the plan. So the global reporting format, as Lars and Arman said, is a new method to assess and report the runway surface condition, and it solves the problem we had in the past, where the runway surface conditions were not correlated with air performance. So we correlate these two and well, this new method will be applicable as of 5th of November 2020, although we know that there are discussions for possible delays. And the other thing which is very, very important for documentation is to know the available documentation. You need to check the ICAO annexes, Annex 3, 6, 8, 14, and 15, PANS aerodromes, which contains a lot of information about the method, and I think it's the most important document, especially for the operators. The PANS AIM, which includes all the information about the SNOWDAM, the PANS ATM, it refers to the phraseology used by controllers and pilots, and Circular 355, which provides additional guidance material for the implementation of the GRF. Considering now the plan, first of all, you need to have an implementation team, either at the regional level, if you are a regional safety oversight organization, like EASA, for example, or at national level. And then you need a plan, which will be followed by education, promotion, training, AIP, and test and analysis. These are the issues that you need to consider when implementing the GRF. They involve stakeholders. We believe that everything should start from the state, from the Civil Aviation Authority. And of course, you need to include the three major players in this method: the aerodrome operators, the air operators, and the air navigation service providers. And with the air navigation service providers, we refer mainly to air traffic services, to aeronautical information management, and MET providers. These are, in practice, the major players for the implementation of the GRF. And, well, it's nothing different from any other project. So you need to assign a project manager. So you need to have someone in the state who is responsible for the implementation of the GRF. Of course, this person cannot be alone, has to be supported by focal points. And mainly, and it's important to have focal points for each and every domain. So you need one focal point for aerodromes, another one for ATM, another one for air operations. So in this way, you ensure that you have enough resources for the implementation of the plan. It also depends on the size of the country and the activity. So for a small country, of course, the project team will be smaller, while for a big country, you expect a lot of people to participate in the implementation team. And then in the project plan, you need to assign the actions and the timelines. And when we are talking about actions, it's the education, the promotion, the training, the testing, and the publication in the AAP. And starting with education, everything starts again by the implementation team. And you know, to start implementing something, you need to understand, first of all, the implementation team, they need to understand what we are talking about. So it's very important this team, the implementation team, reviews all the available documentation and prepares well the regulatory material and information package. And the other thing is, like the webinars we have here or the regional workshops organized by ICAO, you should also consider national workshops and seminars. So it's a method of raising awareness to people. And this should not be considered as training. From my experience, many people consider that participating in one of these events makes them as experts. No, this is totally different. This is to increase awareness and to understand what we are talking about. The training is a different issue. The promotion. So they need to know at national level. And of course, you need to identify the target group. And this is not a secret that air operators, air traffic services, and aerodromes are the target group. But don't forget also the general aviation, business aviation, and military users, because in majority of the cases, they are using the same runways. And imagine that you have a GE aircraft where they were used to receive some information when they were about to land, and now they receive different information. So they need to be aware. The other thing is to explain the objective. I think the presentations by Arman and Lars explain why we changed. And another important thing is to highlight the key differences with the current method. We were using this method for many years. And of course, this change is very, very important, and people need to understand the key differences. And how you can do it? Well, we have the technology to do it with brochures, with a website, with safety meetings. It's a good opportunity, for example, when you have in the aerodromes, the local runway safety teams, the CAA, or members of the implementation team to go there, present the method. So you can use all these means. The training. The training is also, I think it's the most important thing, and I think also Annex 14 contains specific standards for training. And need to identify who has to be trained. Well, the most important is to train the aerodrome staff, the pilots, and ATS, AIS staff, but also the CAA, because there will be the ones that they oversee the application of the method. Customization of the training. We know that not all the states have the same climate conditions. So, especially for the aerodromes, you adjust the training based on the climate conditions and of the aerodrome, but also for the flight crews, you need to consider where they are flying. For example, if you have an air operator who is coming from Africa or Southeast Asia, where normally you are experiencing wet conditions, it's fine for this region to train them for wet conditions, but if they are flying to Europe or to the States, where they encounter snow and ice, they need to be trained also for these conditions. The type of the training. The type of the training should cover both theoretical training, because you need to understand the method, but also practical training. It's very, very important, especially for the aerodrome staff, which they are assessing the runway surface conditions. The other thing is the appointment of instructors. We know that, well, it's a new method and not so many instructors are available. So if people are familiar in their collecting experience, you may use training. And of course, the state and the service providers, they need to develop a training plan. And of course, the training plan needs to cover initial training, which is normally before the applicability date or for new employees, and the recurrent training. The recurrent training normally should be done on a yearly basis, but this is a subject that needs to be discussed between the service providers and the CAA, but it's very, very important. The AIP, the SNOTAM has been changed. There is a new format. So the staff needs to be trained to prepare the SNOTAM. It's the aerodrome staff, which they are preparing the runway condition report, which is almost identical with the SNOTAM, also the AIS staff. And in case you are using automated systems or you are using a software for the generation of the SNOTAMs, of course, the software needs to be updated. And the relevant information has to be included also in the AIP. And well, we are discussing about the delay, and as Lars and Armand said, we should not lose this time. We should use this for training and tests. And the best solution to do this is to involve local operators, air operators, air traffic services providers, and aerodromes, and contact us and organize meetings in order to review the results. But it's not the end. And we know it's the first time that we are testing this method. And we need data to see how well we are doing. And in order to improve the method or to improve training. And the best thing is to set up a database and compare the runway condition report. And normally, where there is a discrepancy, you need to investigate these cases in order to understand why there is such a difference. And as I said before, use this analysis to improve your training and assessment methods. And I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Vasileios. That was excellent. It's actually what you're doing with the European states is exactly what I'm working on as well with the cost cap, and what the ICAO regional offices are working on in helping the states implement these new requirements on time and in an effective way. So if I could ask the three of you to please turn on your cameras, because we're going to go into the question and answer phase now. Yes, so I've got all three of you. So that's great. So to the audience, I think we had a very good sequence of presentations there, because we really went from in reverse order to what we have done in the past, where we started with the ICAO requirements and then how to implement it and what's the benefit at the end. We went the other way around. So what do the pilots need for safer operations? How are we going to give the pilots what they need? So what needs to be implemented? And of course, any implementation requires support. So what EASA is doing in support of its member states is exactly what completes that loop. So we've done, I think, quite well in telling the story there. So we have 83 questions. So we're not going to get through all of those. So as I've said before, those that are sending questions by raising hands or chats, we won't even look at those. So put your questions in the Q&A. And if you have a question in the Q&A and you want it to be answered, I highly recommend you reach out to your friends and colleagues quickly and tell them to quickly like on your question, because that's how it will go to the top. So we're going to go through them. So bear with me, because it's the first time I'm doing this, but I'm going to choose the question with the most likes. And so it goes like this for those that can't see it. What is the ICAO view on the idea presented by EASA to postpone the GRF implementation by at least 6 months due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic? And I think there's another question that is worded slightly similarly further down. So we'll take them together, and maybe it's better if I answer that, since I'm from ICAO. But and so this proposal to postpone the applicability date hasn't just been presented by us. It's been presented by a few states and also industry. But this is in ICAO, changing applicability dates I don't think it's happened before, but obviously we are not living in circumstances that we've experienced before either. So this has been brought into the discussion and review within ICAO. ICAO has several bodies and hierarchy to deal with such discussions. So right now it's being discussed by what is called the Air Navigation Commission. And the Air Navigation Commission is the technical advisory body for the ICAO Council. So the current plan is that this discussion, the outcome of this discussion by the technical group of the Air Navigation Commission will be presented to the ICAO Council next month. And as many of you will know, this is not an ICAO decision. ICAO is made up of its member states, and these groups are made up of the technical experts which come from those member states and from industry organizations. So this analysis will be done, and the proposals will be presented to the ICAO Council next month. And if there is going to be a postponement or a delay to the applicability date, the outcome of that will be known after next month and will be obviously widely publicized. I think I saw in the question there reference to 6 months. So in terms of timing, it's unlikely to be an odd period, because most of the ICAO standards applicability dates always come on November of a year, and that's to do with the ARAC cycle as well and the operations. So if there is going to be a delay, it may be as much as a year. But what was said by all of the speakers, and I fully endorse this because I'm working very closely with the states on how to support this implementation, is that this effort to work on implementation needs to continue at full speed ahead. Actually, as I mentioned during my introduction, having only 6 months left is very, very little time, especially for a state that's just starting to work on this. So all the efforts need to continue based on the current 5th of November 2020 applicability date. If that changes, we'll know within a month, and then implementation plans and schedules may be adjusted accordingly. But for now, I would say that everybody needs to be working based on the current official applicability date and working at full speed in order to be able to achieve that in the best way we can. So sorry for the long answer, but that's, I think, addresses that question. So the next question we have is 2 parts. So maybe I'll ask 2 of our panelists to answer. So I'll go one by one. So the first question is GRF applicable to all airports? And if not, what are the criteria for implementation? So I think this would go back to Annex 14. So maybe I'll let Arman answer this question. So you have to unmute your mic. And
yes, well, when it comes to ICAO standards recommendations, we are really addressing the international traffic as such. And when it comes to domestic aerodromes, they normally follow the same guidelines that's for the international traffic as such. So this way it applies to all. And if you go for the intent of it to have one global reporting format, it implies all airports. But on a domestic level, you have to decide.
And that's exactly right. I think the national regulations in each case will determine whether the domestic airports will follow the recommendations in Annex 14. So thank you for that, Arman. So the second part to the question, and maybe I'll send this one to Vasileios as well, is safety assessment required for this change? And change, I assume the change in the reporting on runway surface conditions. And are there any best practices that can be shared to the community? Vasileios?
Well, I think that the new method is the outcome of a series of incidents and accidents where we said, okay, we need to change. And so the new method has been implemented, and the training syllabus is there, I think is in Circular 355, where we said, okay, we need to change. And so the new method has been implemented, and the training syllabus is there. I think is in Circular 355. I don't think that we need to have a safety assessment because everything is prepared now, and the community, they have to take all this material and implement the method. This is my view.
Thank you. And maybe at a service provider level, maybe they would, as part of their SMS, consider undertaking a safety assessment to be able to at least mitigate any potential risks of this change that's being implemented in the way they're working. But you're right. The overall picture has been through the process, the safety assessment process. It's just whether individual implementing stakeholders would, as part of their SMS, do a safety assessment themselves. Thank you for that. So let me see, because I don't want Lars to go quiet, because I see a lot of questions related to aerodromes. Just bear with me. So there's a question here, let me hit answer live. For dynamic changing conditions of weather, dry to wet to standing water, how can RCR be given at a very busy runway? So I guess, changing met conditions and changing runway surface conditions, how can the whole system keep up to be able to give pilots close to real-time information? Are you able to take that one, Lars?
Yes, I guess I can. It is true that for wet conditions and heavy precipitation, heavy rain, it is particularly difficult to keep up with the situation. And that's why the system includes a feedback loop that Armin has illustrated in his presentation, which is the ARAP. It's the way for the pilots to provide feedback on whether the information that they have been given previously is still applicable, is still representative of the actual conditions. But it's not the only way that an airport should stay abreast of the changing conditions. An airport should be aware of the condition of its runway and of perhaps its vulnerabilities, and know how it behaves in certain conditions, and where or whether any difficult areas exist, and either observe those or derive those from observations of the precipitation over a given time. So it's something that certainly is very dynamic. And that is also, I've seen this question in the list, why we do not ask for airport operators to provide this information on wet runways or even standing water runways necessarily by NOTAM, but to provide it via the shortest channel via ATC.
That's great. Thank you, Lars. So I have another question here. All these questions are getting very high votes now. So this one, maybe again back to you, Vasileios. Runway condition reporting requires trained and competent personnel, because you dealt with this in your presentation. Does ICAO recommend approval of these personnel? And if yes, can the training standards format be shared? Are you able to take that one, Vasileios?
Yes, yes, and maybe Arman also can complement my response later. Well, indeed, it's a standard in ICAO that staff performing the runway surface condition assessment and reporting shall be trained, shall be competent. Well, I don't know what is happening in other regions, but for example, in Europe, we require this, and the training is based on Circular, I think, 355. This is what we have used to propose the training syllabus. We don't give certificates. We don't require certificates, but we need a record for each person that it has completed the initial training, the recurrent training, and sometimes the refresher training if he is absent from work for a long time. This is what we have in Europe.
Thank you, Vasilios. And what you described is applicable in all the ICAO regions, and not just referring to the ICAO global guidance material, but each region has also developed guidance for states and airports in regards to the competencies required for the personnel working both as inspectors and as runway, as I would say, runway inspectors, you know. So don't worry, Armand, because the question that's coming next is the one that's asked most frequently from my experience. But what is the recommended, let me click on answer live. What is the recommended method by ICAO to measure water depth on runway? This question comes up all the time. So maybe you can help Armand.
Well, for reporting, you do an assessment. For the maintenance, you do measurements. As I mentioned in my presentation, the most simple tool is the straight edge and the measuring rod as such. And it will depend upon the kind of the business model for the aerodrome if we want to use more advanced tools. And there are the industry out there selling products where you can map your runway, you can monitor and kind of figure out how much water you have on your runway. But for the reporting part, for the global reporting format and the runway condition report, we are asking for an assessment and the measurements you get for your maintenance. So so there's no really recommended tool other than the measuring rod.
And I think you mentioned that the ruler is one that one should always have handy for this, isn't it? So that's because the 3 millimeter threshold is the key here. Okay, so we have here, sorry, go ahead, Armand.
Yeah, there is the kind of the 3 millimeter. We can end up with a lot of discussions on it, but you should regard it as a trigger value from one action to another.
Thank you. All right, Lars, I've got one here that maybe you can help us with. All these questions are written towards ICAO, but I'm giving you the chance to work on, because you worked on the ICAO standards development. So does ICAO plan to release any guidance on how to or what from SNOTAM 2020 shall be transmitted in ATIS message? So I guess basically is what you said in your presentation, that there's currently some discussion on how to incorporate the GRF within the SNOTAM format within strings of messages. So maybe give a little bit more clarity in that regard.
As Arman would probably want to say, we already provide some guidance on what information should be at the minimum on the ATIS. This is given in the circular 355, if my memory is correct. There's as far as I know, currently no stronger guidance than that in the ICAO realm. The FAA has chosen a more minimalist approach where only the runway condition codes are given unless a request is made by a flight crew to get more detail. The reason for that, the difficulty that we're facing is the length of the report when there are a lot of operational runways at a single aerodrome, and the ATIS is going to reel those all down and provide a lot of information, which can be an issue both for the occupation of the frequency, for the length of time it takes to get to useful information, but also for the update for the ATC. There should be some guidance developed on simplifying the content and adapting it to the context. So when it's wet, it's a very short message. When it gets really complicated is only when you are dealing with winter contaminants. So in most cases, we expect the message to remain within a reasonable length that's still usable and applicable as before.
Yeah, and in this regard, in addition to 355, in Europe, they've developed and published guidance specific to SNOTAMs, and they've done that to support the GRF implementation. And we have another webinar dedicated to that subject in 2 days' time. Yes, so I think for the people who have that same question about the snow times, because I have to understand, I'm working in a region where very few people have seen these snow times or used the snow times, apart from the pilots who are flying to other countries. So this is new for many states. You know how to start issuing snow times because of the GRF. This is guidance that has been developed by Europe will be presented in 2 days' time on another webinar, and is also available already on the GRF website. So I know that we cannot see the faces, but there's probably a few people in the back room that are telling me that I need to come to an end. And this is unfortunate because we now have 100 questions in the question and answer session. So we're going to find a way to go through this and make the answers available to the community, or we'll hold another session in the future to spend more time answering questions as a follow-up to this webinar. Whichever way we'll do it, we'll find a way to answer all these questions, and they won't be lost. We'll keep them. So I'm going to go towards the conclusion now, because we've exhausted our time for questions, and it has come time to close the session. To conclude the session, I would like to mention a few things. I'd like to re-emphasize the need for states to establish a national GRF implementation lead or focal point, a coordination team, and an implementation plan. And this should involve all the stakeholders, the civil aviation authorities, the airport operators, the air navigation service providers from the ATS, MET, and AIS sides, and also the aircraft operators. And aircraft operators, we're not just talking about the airlines, all the aircraft operators, including military and GA, business aviation, should be involved. In this regard, of course, as always, the regional offices of ICAO, the COSCAPs, the RSOs like EASA are ready to assist states with the implementation. I also encourage the audience to attend, as I just mentioned, the next GRF-related webinar on snow times, which will be held in 2 days' time on the 28th of May. And you can find all the information for registration and speakers and so forth on the website. It's very important to refer to the existing guidance material. I think the panelists have mentioned that a few times. There's no need to look for guidance. The guidance already exists. It has already been developed. It's mature. It's international. So make sure that everybody who's involved in the implementation is familiar with this guidance, and also take advantage of the training courses which are already available from ICAO, ACI, IATA, both online and classrooms. So there's a lot of training. And I think Vasileos mentioned this is just a start. This is just to get the initial training done. After that, at a national level, there needs to be both promotion and awareness and detailed training of each stakeholder, right down to on-the-job training of the tasks they're expected to perform. I mentioned the questions today that we'll go through. We'll find a way of answering them. But in the meantime, we do have a GRF website on the ICAO website. You can visit the ICAO GRF website to look for more information. I think you should visit it periodically because we keep on adding things there. And on that website, you'll also find the GRF email for ICAO, which is grf@icao.int. And you can send questions of any nature related to GRF to that email address, and it will be sent to the appropriate person within the organization to answer. So please join me in thanking our panelists. I think all three of you were so good and to the point. And thank you for sharing with us your valuable knowledge and expertise. And I hope that we'll be able to hear from you again in the future. I also want to thank the audience, your patience for not being able to answer all your questions, but we did have record numbers joining this webinar. So much so that I was at one point wondering whether the system would fail because I was starting to see my screen flicker. But anyway, that didn't happen, luckily. So all 1,000 participants plus were able to stay with us till the end. For those that have missed it or want to watch it again, within a few days, we'll post the recording of the session on the ICAO webinars website. So you can share it with your colleagues, you can use it for training, or you can go back to it for reference, whichever you feel. You'll be able to find the whole recording of the webinar there. If you have any feedback on our session today, please complete the survey that you will receive soon after we conclude. That will allow us to further improve the format, because we've just started this a few weeks ago, and as you can see, they've become very popular. So if we could have feedback to improve them, that will be very welcome. So to finish off then from ICAO, goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again soon on another webinar. And thank you again to the panelists who joined me today. Bye-bye.